Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining, everybody. We have Dr. Samantha Marsh here today, and she's going to talk us through the research that Smartphone Free New Zealand, I should get the name right, Smartphone Free Childhood New Zealand part funded. So we funded the over 500 children section of it. And then I think, Sam, are you also going to talk about the caregivers part?
Yeah, I'll touch on that too, yeah.
So we'll talk about that. So this was from November last year, and it was very much, we felt that this piece of work would be really good towards the online inquiry that was happening. And so there was a big push to get it done with Sam and the University of Auckland for that. And obviously that's come out recently. So this is perfect timing really for you to go over this research. So take it away.
Cool. So I'm going to try and share my screen, but I just need to make sure. Wait, hang on. Okay, I'm going to share this, and then I need you to tell me whether you are seeing presenter view or other view. What are you seeing? If I do that, are you seeing just my slides?
We are, yeah.
Right, yeah, so you don't, okay, cool. All right, so because I've got an hour, and I don't have an hour worth of research to show you, what I thought I would do is give a little bit of an overview about the research in the space, because there's so much, there's so many people that come out and say a whole lot of things that really aren't accurate, but they cite research and they say, well, the research is mixed, or this brand new study show that there's no harm. So I thought I would take the opportunity to kind of go through the research to reassure everyone that the research is very solid in this area. And then it also creates the context for the research that we did for with Smartphone Free. So if everybody's happy with that, just to begin with, what is social media? Because I always get criticized for not including this at the beginning of a presentation. So just so everybody's on the same page, when I'm talking about social media, I'm talking about the websites and apps that enable users to create and share content. So those ones that I've listed are kind of the biggest ones. Now I'm going to start with kind of what everybody sees. It's from Anxious Generation. Jonathan Haidt talked a lot about this, but this is mainly from Jean Tweng's work. But basically just the overall trends that we're seeing in youth mental health. So this is anxiety. The blue line is the younger generation, and we see this increase in anxiety prevalence from 2012. Similar with depression. So this is in school-age kids. That top line, the solid line, is females. There's 2012. There's this increase. And unfortunately, it's not because our kids are just talking about it more because they feel more comfortable, because we see the same thing reflected in actual behaviors. So that purple line is suicide and the green line is self-poisoning. Now, that's not just overseas statistics. So this is from New Zealand, published a couple of years ago by a different research group. And they found that there's this rapid and unequal decline in adolescent mental health and well-being between 2012 and 2019 in New Zealand. And what they mean by unequal is Māori, Pacific, lower socioeconomic groups, and females. Those are where we're really seeing those trends. And so the question is, what might be contributing to this? Jean Twenge published IGN in 2017, and she was really the first person to say something's going on, and I think it's social media or smartphones, because she looked at a whole lot of things. So she looked at the economic crisis, she looked at school shootings in the States, she looked at climate anxiety, but the only thing that really made sense was smartphones and social media. So a number of things happened around that time. So it was around that time that over 50% of American adults had got a smartphone. It was when Facebook bought Instagram, and also around the popularization of that front-facing camera, which just enabled people to take selfies and post them to social media. Now, in this paper, this manuscript from New Zealand academics, they mention the potential for social media to be causing this once in the whole paper, and they kind of dismiss it. And then they talk about all these other things which Jean Twenge already had kind of gone through and shown that it was very unlikely to be those other things because they just didn't make sense. And so there's really two things when people criticize that social media might be the potential driver for this change in mental health that we're seeing, that I want to point out. So first of all, no one's actually come up with a better solution. And oftentimes when people say it, they'll say, well, wouldn't it be nice if it was social media, as if that's an easy fix, which I think we're seeing right now, that this is not going to be something easy to fix. But they also kind of say it in a way, it's like, it's so obvious, you know, that we need to dig deeper, which I think we should question. And the other thing is I often think we're arguing over the wrong question, because it doesn't actually matter whether social media is increasing this, you know, leading to this decline in adolescent mental health that we're seeing. It matters if social media causes harm to children. So it doesn't need to be the driver of this trend that we've seen. If it's causing harm, then we should still be concerned about it. And it is linked very consistently in the research to all these negative health outcomes. So poor sleep, mental health outcomes, eating disorders, disordered eating, increased loneliness. Getting a bit more attention now is the cognition issue, so the impacts on attention. And then also what often gets missed is the physical symptoms as well. So I've got references for all these, but I basically put this list together for my submission to the government, and all this, all the evidence very consistently shows when we look at systematic review. So that's not relying on an individual study, but actually looking at all the studies together. And when we look at all the studies together, this is very, very consistent. So when people say the evidence is murky, I would question that. They also talk about, you know, that there are small effect sizes, or that there are other studies that show conflicting things. And I'm going to just touch on those briefly, just to reassure you that oftentimes there's not much actually behind those arguments. But just for the just before I move on, I just want to say that a lot of people capitalize on the fact that social media is a really difficult behavior to measure. And so then they kind of disregard all research. And that's why we use systematic reviews. So what I mean by it's a hard behavior to measure is almost all the research we have just asked people, how much time do you spend on social media in a week? Which I'm barely on social media. I just use LinkedIn. I don't think I could answer that accurately. And then it doesn't take into account content and whether you're particularly vulnerable to the harmful effects, and, you know, when you use it, all those things. So I'm not going to get too much into the science about small effect sizes, but this is used a lot to say that we shouldn't be worried about social media. So that's why I want to talk about it. An effect size is it's just a number that, you know, you can have a small effect size, a medium effect size, or a large effect size. And it's basically just talking about how strong the relationship is between social media and an outcome. Now, the first thing is that we're talking about a public health problem here. So we're not talking about individual kids. So, you know, a few thousand kids in a generation. This is almost all children. And so when we're talking at the population level, even very small clinical effect sizes can have profound effects and result in, you know, overburdening of the healthcare system. We also know that when we're talking about mental health, that, you know, there's so many drivers of mental health issues, so it's multifaceted. And if you're looking at any one thing, you're bound to have a small effect size. But so the correlation between social media use and mental health outcome in adolescents tends to be between 0.1 and 0.15, with stronger correlations found in girls. So I'm just going to give a little bit of context here. So the relationship between calcium intake and bone mass in premenopausal women is smaller than that. So, and we were seeing about the same effect size for the impact of ibuprofen and pain relief. Aspirin and prevention of heart attacks is much smaller, and childhood lead exposure and adult IQ is about the same. And I'm using that here because just looking at the impact of short form videos alone on these cognition, attention, and inhibitory control, so executive function skills, these are much larger. And I don't know of many parents who are happy for their kids to go and play with lead, but the impact of social media is consistently, so this is also from a review article, shown to have quite what we would call a moderate impact on all these outcomes. Now, this study here, this is one of the studies I want to use to kind of explain why you can't always listen to even academics when they talk about this topic. So a paper was released, I think it was last year, an opinion piece by some academics in New Zealand. And this study has been used a lot in New Zealand to demonstrate that social media isn't harmful. So these researchers show that the association between digital technology use and adolescent well-being is negative, meaning it does have a negative impact, but small, explaining at most 0.4% of the variation in well-being. Now, this paper has actually been largely discredited by academics. So other academics went back, reanalyzed it, and actually showed that the impact is much larger. But what I want to draw attention to is that this study didn't even look at social media. It looked at an aggregate measure. So it looked at watching TV, gaming, sending emails. All these things were wrapped up in digital technology use. So we can't rely on the study to show that social media is not harmful. Now, this study is interesting because this is from this year, and it's in JAMA Pediatrics, which is one of the, it's a very high quality journal. And they found that in this very large group of Australian adolescents, that there was this U-shaped association where moderate social media use was associated with the best wellbeing outcomes, while both no and highest use were associated with poorer wellbeing. And these researchers have really used this study as a reason why we shouldn't be putting age restrictions on social media. Now, you don't need to look very hard to see why maybe we shouldn't be listening to this. And I'm really surprised that the study even got published. But this is how they measured exposure, which is exposure to social media. Self-reported after-school social media use between 3 and 6 p.m. on weekdays. So they looked at a 15-hour period over 5 days. And if you didn't use social media after school during those hours, you were classified as an abstainer, so you don't use social media. So this could be that kids work after school and then come home and binge use social media for, 5 hours, but they'd still be classified as somebody who doesn't use social media. And then the next thing that really concerned me is how they classified the use. So they said, so those were the non-users, but then moderate use was anything above 0 minutes to 12.5 hours. So that's quite a wide window of use, because you're basically saying somebody could be using social media for 1 minute in a week and you're still classified as a moderate user. So this sort of thing we see in other areas like alcohol. So for years, we were told that we should have a little bit of alcohol every day. It was good for us, until researchers realized that abstainers were actually quite different to the general population. They tended to be recovering alcoholics or having health issues, which meant they couldn't drink. And so even if these kids were abstainers, you'd still need to look in to see what's going on, because the kids that I've spoken to who aren't on social media, a lot of them were on there and were like severely bullied and took themselves off it. So, and then finally, I don't think that this is showing that social media has a positive effect, but that it is currently where everyone is. And if you're not on there, there is a chance that you could be socially isolated. Another thing that we often hear in the media is that there's no evidence of causation of harm, that it's all just correlation. And this is partly because we can't run a traditional, what we call it, a randomized control trial. So we can't randomize a whole group of kids to grow up in a community where no kids are on social media, and another group to grow up where it is, and then compare them over time. And this was just like tobacco. So we couldn't run a randomized control trial where we randomized people to smoke because it was unethical. But there are other ways that we can demonstrate causation. And so what we're beginning to see more and more of are these studies where they take the phone away, or they take social media away. So this was a study that was done, I think it was published last year, and they did a 3-week smartphone reduction in young adults, and they found significant improvements in depressive symptoms, stress, sleep quality, and well-being. And at the end of the study, when the participants went back to their usual use, what they found was that all those benefits that they had gained during that reduction were lost. And that led these researchers to say that the results suggest a causal relationship rather than a merely correlative one between daily smartphone screen time and mental health. So I do want to say that we are getting closer to demonstrating causality, and there is certainly evidence of causation. So when you hear people say that, or you get asked it, that's actually, you can push back against that. Now, another thing is that people always say, well, you're just looking at the research and you're not listening to what young people actually say themselves. So I'm just going to very briefly present, this is from a systematic review of what we call qualitative research. So that's just when researchers go and talk to young people. So they're not filling in surveys, but they're doing focus groups or interviews. And these researchers identified these 5 main categories that kids, these 5 main themes. So the first one is that social media is a place for self-expression and validation. So this was a mixed thing. So they said there were positive impacts, but they also said that they were actually short-lived. And what really happens is that over time, people, they became very reliant on what people thought of them, and they got involved in these feedback loops. So they knew what people wanted to hear, what they would get likes, and they actually began to change who they were. So not super great for things like identity formation. The next one is appearance and body image. So kids talked about this need to be perfect in order to get likes, that they began to place a lot of value on what they looked like. Social comparisons reduced their self-esteem. Interestingly, boys said that they knew this about girls, and they used it on purpose to bully them. So one of the quotes from that study was, if someone is insecure about their appearance, then people tend to use that. It's a good weapon. And then obviously eating disorders and relapses was quite common as well. This was another mixed theme. So kids talked about, being on social media, there was less pressure to connect than when in person, and that it really supported engagement and connection. But then they also talked about how they valued their real life friends more, and that they couldn't rely on their online friends. And the researchers of this study actually said that they were quite concerned about these kids. So what happens to these kids when something goes really wrong in their life and they turn to their online friends for support, and not only are they going through something really bad, but they also realize that these friends who they thought were their friends aren't really there for them. Pressure to stay connected, fear of missing out dominated their lives. So for example, with streaks, so that's on Snapchat, this pressure to stay connected. So I spoke to one young girl who at one point had about 200 streaks going, was messaging them about 2 to 3 times a day each, which resulted in about 600 messages on some days. So not surprisingly, then these kids talked about this leading to decreased quality time with friends and family, and then impacts on their physical health and sleep. And then the final theme was what I think we all know is cyberbullying and harmful content, but it was still really hard to read because the kids talked about how this is just really normal now. This has become normalized. And they also talked about social exclusion, which is a lot more subtle, but can be very, very harmful. And also that the damaging content that they were seeing was having significant effects on their mental health. So that's that study. So we've talked about the general research linking social media and harm. We've talked about beginning to emerge the causation evidence, what the kids are saying. But I want to talk about one other part of research, and that is what the companies say themselves, because the companies arguably have the best data out there. So this is Mark, and he says that the research that we've seen is that using social apps to connect with other people can have positive mental health benefits. For those, I'm sure everybody knows, but he's the CEO of Meta. And this is very interesting because around the time he said that, they'd also just completed some research that showed that we make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. And this wasn't just Meta, so we've also got stuff from TikTok, so internal documents from legal proceedings in the US that were incorrectly redacted. So this is an internal document that social media interferes with essential personal responsibilities like sufficient sleep, work, school responsibilities, and connecting with loved ones. And minors do not have executive function to control their screen time, which is interesting because these companies really kind of push this idea that we're going to empower young people to use these platforms in a healthy way, but actually they know that they actually don't have the brain capacity to do that in the early adolescent years. And this is a headline from last year, that Meta buried causal evidence of social media harm. So this was from a 2019 study. It was an experimental deactivation study. It was called Project Mercury. And they designed this study. So researchers designed the study to demonstrate causation. And what they did is they asked users to deactivate their Facebook and Instagram accounts for a month. And this is what they found, was that those who stopped using Facebook for a week reported lower feelings of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and social comparison. But instead of changing their product, they just shut down that study. And this finally is an internal review that they did where they aggregated findings from adolescent brain development research with their own research of, I think, about 80 studies. They found that teens' decisions and behavior are mainly driven by emotion, the intrigue of novelty and reward. They make teens very vulnerable at the elevated levels they operate on, especially in the absence of a mature frontal cortex to help impose limits on indulgence in these. So if you're interested in that, you can, here we go. You can go to Meta's internalresearch.org. I think there's about 31 studies there which have been leaked by whistleblowers or made public through litigation. Okay, but before I move on, I do want to talk about some of the benefits of social media, because I don't want to come across as, just focusing on the harms. So these are some of the main benefits that people talk about, entertainment and escapism. Now, social media is hugely entertaining. I don't think anybody's arguing that. But if kids are using it to escape from problems, that's what we would call a maladaptive coping mechanism. So we don't want kids to be really struggling at school and then to come home and just go online to ignore their problems. We want them to sit, talk to their parents, talk to their friends, think about it and kind of come up with solutions. Now, people often talk about social media being this amazing place for connection, but again, this isn't backed up by research. So the more friends that people have on social media, the lonelier they actually tend to be. And I think we are confusing social networking with relationship here. And we want young people to have deep relationships. And actually what we know from the research is that kids only need, or anybody actually only needs 3 to 5 very close friends, no more than that, and about 15 in their wider group, and then about 150 in their wider community. And the human brain actually can't handle much more than that. It is overwhelming. So when you've got kids with all these friends online, what we also find or see happen is that they prioritize those friends and really don't spend time connecting with their friends in person. Education, there are great places to get education and find out information on the internet. Social media is not one of them. It's filled with people who are trying to sell things, even if it's themselves. They tend to, make things seem really sensational because that's what gets followers. And so it's just filled with misinformation. And then creativity. Research shows that kids who just scroll passively on social media actually have reduced creativity, those who use it in what we would consider to be a creative way, and so making content, it has no impact on their creativity. And we just need to look at what the conditions are for creativity to understand this. So you need to be in a flow state, which means you can't be interrupted. You need time for self-reflection, and you need to take risks and feel free from the pressure to conform. Now, identity formation is possibly the thing that I really dislike the most. Psychology academics talk about this in New Zealand, that it's social media is great for identity formation. So this is just a process basically that happens between 11 and 15. It's when our kids kind of go out into the world and are trying to figure out who they are. We want them to do that. We want them to go a little bit out, learn some new things, come back, talk to their friends, talk to their parents, sit with it, have some self-reflection, see if it aligns with their values. But what happens on social media is they're just being bombarded with other people's values constantly. They get kind of sent down rabbit holes, and if they feel like it's not really them, it's very hard to get out of it because they will lose their community. And we're actually seeing what is called premature identity formation closure. So kids figuring out who they are and sticking with an identity much younger than we would want them to. And then finally, they say it's a great place for mental health support. I did a opinion piece about this last year with a psychologist in Australia, Dr. Danielle Einstein, just going through, like, most of the time kids aren't getting evidence-based support. They're just getting people's individual stories. It's a place where things like eating disorders and self-harm are glamorized. So I would argue that it's actually not a great place for mental health support either. So really this is to show that while there might be benefits, they very much exist in what I would consider a duality, and that they might be some, but they also come with harms as well. On the other hand, the harms are just harms. There are no benefits to self-harm or suicide ideation or anything like that. Now, that's not a complete list. I just kind of wrote until I got to the end of the page. But just to show, because oftentimes in the media, people talk about, you'll talk about the harms, and then people will be like, oh, well, there's this other stuff, as if it somehow balances it out, which it doesn't. And of course it doesn't, because if it was balanced, or even balanced in the favor of benefits, we would see that reflected in mental health outcomes. We would see the research showing that actually social media use reduces anxiety. But of course we don't. Now, I'm not going to go into much about the mechanisms, but I think it's just important to kind of highlight all the ways, we've got all these harms, but how does social media lead to those harms? And so I've just kind of written the main ones there. And when I talk in schools and things, I go into a lot of depth about these, but I'm assuming that, you all know about this stuff. But it's important to know that the teen brain is particularly vulnerable to those harms. And that is because there's a number of reasons. So the way the teen brain is developing is that the limbic system, which is kind of the middle part of the brain, it's where all the emotional part of the brain, that is really exploding in growth in the teen years, particularly those early teen years. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is, meant to kind of put the brakes on, make us kind of consider our decisions and things like that, that's just developing in a relatively linear fashion. And so it kind of gets, there's this imbalance in the brain in adolescence where it's really being driven by the limbic system. And when our kids are on social media, the limbic system is all lit up and the prefrontal cortex largely goes offline, because all the content that they're seeing is designed to stir up emotion, because that's what holds attention. Then we also know that kids have this heightened sensitivity to social rewards. So they're really primed for connection. And this is how social media is designed. It really exploits that. They're less sensitive to risk. So they can, they can see something on social media. It's harmful, but they don't see it like we would see it, because their brain is designed for risk. And we don't really know why, but we think it's for things like, it's risky to leave the home and go out and meet new people in the next community over and things like that. Now, I just want to talk, about the mismatch again, just because one of the things that has come out a lot is that we just need to teach children to use these platforms safely, so digital literacy skills. But first of all, the research shows that there's almost no long-term benefit to digital literacy programs. And that's even in the, that they're looking at very specific outcomes that are whatever they define digital literacy as. But those skills don't translate into improvements in well-being. And that's what we care about. That's what we should be basing that on. So I don't think that is an appropriate response to this issue. And that makes a whole lot of sense, because if their brains are really, that prefrontal cortex goes offline when they're on social media, that's where all that learning would be. And they just can't access it when they're on these platforms. And then finally, just their reward system is in overdrive. So I just want to touch on that very briefly before I move on to the results of the study that we did. So I'm not sure if you have all read Anna Lempke's book called Dopamine Nation. It's very good. She's an addiction expert from Stanford, and she's actually been in the trials in America at the moment with Meta and Google. But I'm just going to use her description of what we think is happening when kids are on social media, because I think it's really helpful to understand what's happening in the brain. So we basically have this baseline level of dopamine. Dopamine is really important. Without it, we would die, because it motivates us to do work, and we need to work to survive. So when we do things that we should find motivating, like playing sport or spending time with people or out in nature, we get a little increase in dopamine. And then that goes back to baseline, and we carry on and we feel good. So we're rewarded for that. So we want to do it again. We're motivated to do that behavior again. This is really important when you're thinking about schoolwork and kids studying. Now, what they think happens with social media and other things like gaming is it unnaturally spikes the dopamine level in the brain. So it's a highly rewarding but a very low effort behavior. And so what happens then is the brain tries to reach an equilibrium. And in order to do that, it corrects and goes below baseline for a little bit with dopamine. And we experience that as craving and a bit of a low mood. But if you don't engage in that behavior anymore, then your levels return to baseline and you carry on. Now, the problem with something like social media, it is so easy to engage in over and over again. So over time, we flood our brain with dopamine. And what they're concerned is happening is the baseline level actually reduces. And so then we're in a situation where the things that should be rewarding, like doing sport and spending time with friends in person, are no longer rewarding. So we're really taking a lot of joy away from our children when we allow them to have access to these platforms when they're young. Okay, so that was the background and the research. And now I'm going to talk about what we did, because most of this research comes from overseas. And we need to know what is happening in New Zealand and with New Zealand teens in order to know whether we can, kind of translate that research here. So this wasn't about demonstrating harm, because we have so much research about that already. And it is actually a huge study, and it would be a very long study to do that. But what we wanted to do was try and close our knowledge gaps in local data. So we wanted to know how teens use and experience phones and social media. We wanted to know what the prevalence of problematic use was, and also what teens thought about age restrictions. So the aim was to understand teen and caregiver experiences of smartphones and social media. So Smartphone Free funded the teen study, and the Freemasons studied the caregiver study. So the studies were independent or unlinked, which meant the teens we spoke to weren't the children of the caregivers we spoke to. But in the teen study, we talked to 13 to 17-year-olds, and in the caregiver study, we talked to caregivers of people aged 10 to 17 years. Now, this went through ethics approval at the University of Auckland, and the reason why I'm putting that in is because there have been a couple of studies that have been done recently that got quite a bit of immediate attention that were funded by Meta. And they called them independent studies. I don't know how they could be independent studies. They just didn't run them themselves, but they would have said what the questions were and things like that. But for this to go through ethics from the University of Auckland, it meant that we had to be very careful that we weren't asking leading questions. We weren't trying to elicit a specific response out of the teens and their parents. So we got 540 13 to 17-year-olds, and we got 533 parents. So the sample was relatively representative of the New Zealand population. So it was from all over New Zealand, all different levels of deprivation and age groups. Okay, so this is what we found. So the first part is focusing on smartphone use. So 98% of teens own or have access to a smartphone. The average amount of time spent on smartphones each day is 4 hours, which is a huge amount of time. And but this is, I think, a very important statistic for you guys as ambassadors, is that 44% say that they got access to early. So we know that kids beg their parents for phones, but I think it's important for parents to know that actually almost half of kids then go on to later say they were given them, their parents gave them access too early. Now the age, so most kids got their phones between 11 and 13 years, and it's really important because it's kind of the intermediate years, and we see it happening. My daughter just started intermediate school, and lots of parents start to give phones at this stage because they're like, wow, they're catching a bus and they need to be in contact with me, because kids aren't necessarily going to local schools anymore. And then, as I said, this is the distribution of how much time was spent on phones. Alarmingly, 11% are spending 7+ hours, but we found that a third of them spend at least 5 hours on their phone a day. So that's a significant amount of time away from other activities. Okay, so now moving on to social media, because when kids are on their phones, they're usually on social media. And so what we found was that 90% of teens use social media. So it's, ubiquitous. It's what most kids are doing. 62% started between ages 10 and 13, keeping in mind what age you're allowed to start using it with age restrictions. The average time on there was 2.5 hours. That aligned with what the parents said as well. In fact, a lot of the findings that we found were very consistent between parent and child report. 72% said that they were online almost constantly or several times a day. 49% say that it interrupts other activities. And these are the activities that they're talking about. So basically saying that social media interferes with chores at home, schoolwork, time with family, sleeping. All these activities that we know from literally decades of research are really, really good for brain development and relationships and well-being. Now, this is the impact of social media on behaviour. So 40% of our kids said that they tried to spend less time on social media but failed. 39% said that they often use social media to escape from negative feelings. And 39% often ignored other activities because they wanted to use social media. So these are classic indicators of what we call problematic or risky use of social media. Teens describing it, being difficult to cut back, using social media for emotional coping and neglecting other activities. So really patterns that mirror dependency behaviours. And these are the findings from the problematic social media use scale. So this is probably one of the most scary things that we found. So this scale is used to describe, so it's 9 questions and kids just say yes or no to them. They're asking about how social media interferes with their life. And what's concerning about this is we got about 22% of kids who meet this criteria for problematic use. When we looked at girls, it was 25%, so a quarter of girls. Now, in academia, we refer to it as problematic use because the DSM-5, which is like the diagnostic manual for psychologists and psychiatrists, doesn't list social media addiction as a thing. So you're not really allowed to say it's an addiction, but this is based on an addictive questionnaire. It mirrors all the symptoms of addiction. And as we're seeing from these trials in the States at the moment, these companies believe their product is addictive, they're designing it to be addictive, and the pattern of use that they're seeing is mirroring addiction. So basically from this, we can kind of gather that about a quarter of our girls meet this criteria, which is really terrifying, particularly because, so this is a study from this year, and they found that problematic mobile phone use and social media use were prospectively. So that just means they took it, they measured this at one point in time, and then a year or two later, they measured these other things. And it was associated with higher depressive, somatic, attention deficit, oppositional defiant, and conduct problem scores, suicidal behaviors, sleep disturbance, and substance initiation. So we don't want kids to have problematic social media use. That's really scary, and that's going to have a big impact on society. We also found that almost 40% of the kids wished social media had not been invented. Now, this is also really important because we have this picture being painted where 90% of kids are on these platforms, they're on there for hours every day, but 4 out of 10 say that it wish it hadn't been addicted, which to me is telling us that kids are really, they don't want to be on these platforms, but they're trapped there. And, you just have to think about another behavior. So if I didn't like soccer, I wouldn't say that I wish soccer had never been invented. I just wouldn't play soccer. So something really unusual is going on here. So that was a very interesting finding, good for parents as well. And also finally that 47% of the kids said that they supported an age restriction, and 28% were kind of just like, they didn't really care either way, and only 25% were actually opposed to it. So there's this narrative out there that New Zealand kids really don't want this, but that's not what our research showed. And we asked this question in a very, very neutral way. And then finally, we also found that 77% of parents supported age restrictions. So just to summarize, our kids are on these platforms that are known to be harmful for multiple hours a day. 22% meet that criteria for basically addiction, and almost 40% wish that social media had never been invented. So I'd like to just thank, these are the other researchers. So Amber Young from University of Otago, Claire Reid is a PhD student at the University of Auckland. She's looking at the impacts of screens on brain development and executive function in kids, and Dr. Joanna Chu at University of Auckland, who is an expert in youth mental health. And also to Smartphone Free, who funded this research because it's almost impossible to get funding in this space in New Zealand. So they actually made this possible. And then I just put through together some final thoughts for you guys, which is don't be derailed by results from single research studies. The research really does consistently point to harm. The benefits do not outweigh the harms of smartphones and social media. A lot of the arguments against delaying access to smartphones and social media are based on narratives, not the research. And you even see this from the researchers themselves. So I saw a researcher from Canterbury recently talking about age restrictions being prohibition. She actually used that term. That is just, that's a social media term. This is not prohibition. We don't say that tobacco is prohibited in New Zealand. It's just an age restriction. And I just wanted to finish with this because, at the moment, the use of social media is a social norm in New Zealand, just like smoking was. But social norms do change, and, we can begin to counter some of these unhelpful narratives in New Zealand, because even things like age restrictions and stuff like that, they're unlikely to actually have a big impact on outcomes. But they're really there to support parents, empower parents, and to begin shifting norms, because that's what actually brings about change. And that's why it's so important that you guys are all out there talking to schools, trying to get some momentum in this area. And that is it. I think I've just got a whole lot of references, which I can share later.
Thank you so much, Sam. Like, honestly, your presentations are such a journey. And I've been to a few of them now, and that was fantastic. I'm gonna open up the floor for questions. We're a nice sort of intimate group, so I hope there's some questions, or even just if anyone had some notes about some particularly like shocking statistics or something they'd like to reflect on.
I would like to thank everybody for doing this on your Friday night.
Oh, thank you so much, Sam. That came across so well, and even though I'd heard you talk about it a bit before, that was actually really helpful to have the reiteration and just the comparison with the other studies, and thinking, no, it's not founded on the same basis that you did, and how diligent your research was and things. And thank you so much, because came out in the news report today as well. It was great to see the study quoted, and New Zealand needed these stats. So thank you so much for your work on it. I suppose my question would be, what do you think, like, what would be needed next in terms of, like, where would you hope to go next with your research and another survey? Or do you feel like you've covered enough? Or in terms of trying to combat those people who come up with these, it's not cool, it's not related to causation, or, just spelling, or being disparaging about showing social harms, like where would you go next to try and counter those arguments?
With respect to research, I would love to do something with teens themselves. So I'm not sure if you've read, Hannah, I've written a little bit about it, but the approach to what we did with tobacco. And because that was just like a behavior that was just, we could not change. And then the only thing that ever worked was what's called a truth campaign, where you just kind of go to kids. You don't say don't smoke, but you like, hey, did you know this tobacco companies do this to target you guys? And you kind of just like lay it out, and then you walk away. And I do talk in schools, and I use a truth campaign type style with the kids themselves. And so I think it would be very interesting to research that, to see if we could, like, what the impact of something like that is. I also work in the Department of General Practice and Primary Healthcare. So I was presenting last week to GPs, and I was talking about how we've got this problematic use, and we know that it's related to these negative outcomes. And, there's a potential to screen. I mean, the questionnaire is 9 questions. It's very quick to identify these kids. But what do you do after you screen them? Because it's kind of unethical to screen them, because we've got no pathways in New Zealand to help these children at the moment. So even psychologists, there'll be a couple who are really clued up in this space. Most aren't. Most don't know what to do. And we also know that kids who go to psychologists and their doctors, they don't present with a social media or a smartphone problem. They present with sleep disorders and anxiety and depression and school refusal. And so, there has to be a whole lot of education for parents, for the clinicians as well. But talking to GPs, they saw this as a massive issue, and they just don't know what to do about it. So I'm currently working with a friend who is a child psychologist, a family psychologist, to put together a resource for medical professionals in New Zealand that they can then say, they can give it to parents as a, because most GPs have 15 minutes with, and even pediatricians, they don't have time to deal with this stuff. With respect to the narratives and the unhelpful narratives out there, there are things to do. I've actually done a few courses on how to shift narratives, and it's like taking people on a journey, really appealing to their emotions and not just giving them statistics and things like that. But it's hard. I tend to write opinion pieces a lot to try and, but I do think things are shifting. So when I talk to parents, most of them are on board with this messaging now. Most of them are on board. But then sometimes I'm surprised at how many parents don't have a clue, like really just don't know anything about it. So it seems to be, But that's kind of what I'm working on at the moment. I have had a lot of media people come to me recently, like even today, asking me to write opinion pieces because they think that that's what's needed out there. And so that's
good.
Good. Yeah, I need people to read them though.
Hey Sam, just a quick question, and it's probably a bit of a difficult one, but Like if we were all vegetarians and we were arguing against the meat industry, then we could sort of understand all these farmers and butchers who'd be arguing against us. What I don't understand, because I come across so many people who, until recently I sort of respected professionally, and you've hinted at a few of them already. What's the motivation behind them being so oppositional? Because it's not like they're getting some sort of financial or societal boost by having that opinion, as there are in so many other controversial things that track back to money, because there's no money to follow here with the people in New Zealand who are opposing it.
Yeah, so are we still recording?
I'll stop.
Stop the recording.
I'll stop recording.